There are names that have survived longer than the empires that produced them. They sit quietly on mailboxes, passports, and gravestones, carried by people who have no idea what they are actually holding. A surname feels ordinary. It feels like paperwork. But some of these names are not paperwork at all. They are fragments, the last surviving pieces of dynasties, warlords, and bloodlines that history books forgot to finish telling us about. For centuries, most people assumed surnames were simple. A name told you a father's name, a job, a village, a landmark. Neat, local, forgettable. Then genealogists and geneticists began doing something unusual. They started treating surnames not as labels, but as evidence. And in a small number of cases, that evidence did not lead to a village. It led somewhere much older and much stranger. This is the story of 13 surnames that were never supposed to be extraordinary, and why some researchers now believe a handful of ordinary family names may be the last living echo of forgotten European dynasties. For most of European history, the explanation for surnames was tidy. Historians and linguists divided them into a few reliable categories. Patronymic names, built from a father's first name. Johnson, meaning son of John. Occupational names, describing a trade. Baker, mason, miller. Locational names, tied to geography. Hill, Ford, Wood. And a smaller group of aristocratic or dynastic names, tied to noble houses that once ruled specific territories. This system made sense because it matched how medieval record-keeping actually worked. As populations grew and taxation, land ownership, and church registries expanded, people needed a way to be distinguished from every other person with the same first name in a village. Surnames solved a bureaucratic problem before they became a symbol of identity. Under this model, most surnames were assumed to be relatively recent, often no older than the 11th or 12th century in most of Europe, becoming fixed and hereditary over the following few hundred years. A name like Smith did not require a hidden history. It required a blacksmith. This explanation held for a long time, and for good reason. It is broadly accurate for the overwhelming majority of surnames in Europe. But a name being common does not mean every name in that category tells the same story, because a small number of surnames did not behave the way the model predicted. Genealogists working with medieval land records began noticing something odd in specific regional cases. Certain surnames appeared repeatedly in association with property rights, minor noble titles, or church privileges that persisted across many generations, long after the supposed founder event that was assumed to have created the name. In some family lines, legal documents referenced ancestral claims going back further than the standard occupational or locational explanation could account for. In others, oral family tradition insisted on a noble or dynastic origin that mainstream records seemed to contradict or simply failed to preserve. Historians have long been cautious about this kind of claim, and rightly so. Noble ancestry myths were common. Many families invented prestigious backstories once surnames became inheritable status markers. The line between real dynastic descent and later fabrication is often blurry, and archival gaps make it genuinely difficult to separate fact from wishful reconstruction. But not every anomaly could be explained away as invention. This is where genetics entered a conversation that had, for centuries, belonged almost entirely to historians and archivists. Researchers realized that one particular biological feature of European surnames made them unusually useful for genetic study. In most of Europe, surnames have historically passed down the same line as the Y chromosome, father to son, generation after generation, in the same direction. That overlap meant something powerful. If a surname and a genetic marker travel together for enough generations, then men sharing that surname today should, in theory, also share detectable genetic similarity on the Y chromosome, even if they had never met, never knew of each other, and lived in different countries. This is not full genome ancestry testing. It is narrower and, in some ways, more precise. Y chromosome analysis focuses specifically on the direct paternal line, offering a way to test whether a shared name reflects a shared biological male ancestor. rather than a coincidence of language or geography. If you want to understand how deep some of these family stories actually go, this is exactly the kind of hidden history worth following. And it's part of why I keep making videos like this one. If that interests you, subscribing helps more of these stories reach people who'd otherwise never hear them. When researchers began testing groups of unrelated men who happened to share rare, historically aristocratic surnames, the results did not simply confirm the traditional story. They complicated it. In several documented surname studies across the UK and parts of continental Europe, men sharing a specific surname showed a notably higher rate of Y chromosome matches than would be expected by chance, sometimes dramatically higher, especially for rarer surnames tied to a single historical point of origin. That was not the surprising part. Historians expected some consistency for names with a genuinely singular founding event. The surprising part was how the matches were distributed. In some cases, men from very different social classes, a landowner and a tenant farmer, a professional and a laborer, shared the same Y chromosome signature, despite centuries of assumed social separation. The name had persisted across a class divide that history books had treated as nearly impermeable. In other cases, the reverse occurred. Men sharing an identical, seemingly rare surname showed no genetic relationship to one another at all, meaning the name had been adopted independently multiple times by unrelated families, often for reasons that had nothing to do with shared descent. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It suggested that the history of a single surname was not one story, but several, layered on top of each other and wearing the same name like a mask. Several explanatory frameworks emerged to make sense of this. One is what researchers sometimes call a founder effect, a name that genuinely does trace back to one man, whose descendants multiplied and spread the surname widely, carrying a recognizable genetic thread through hundreds of years. A second is independent adoption, the same descriptive or locational surname arising separately in different regions, because two villages both happen to have a Miller or a Hill or a man named John's son, without any shared bloodline at all. A third, and the most historically loaded, is what some genealogists describe as dynastic absorption, cases where an illegitimate line, a name change for political protection, or a deliberate erasure during conflict caused a genuinely noble paternal line to continue quietly under an ordinary-sounding name, hidden from the official record but not from the genome. No single framework explains all 13 surnames researchers have flagged as genetically unusual, and that, uncomfortably, may be the most honest conclusion available. One of the more significant pieces of evidence came from a broader wave of surname-based genetic studies conducted in the 2000s and 2010s, which combined Y chromosome testing with detailed archival genealogy across multiple generations of the same family lines. These studies were notable not for testing a handful of volunteers, but for cross-referencing genetic data against parish records, land deeds, and probate documents stretching back centuries. What made this approach powerful was scale and cross-verification. A single genetic match proves little on its own, but a genetic match that aligns with an unbroken paper trail of inherited land, titles, or legal disputes going back to a specific medieval or early modern figure is a very different kind of evidence, one that connects biology and archive rather than relying on either alone. In a number of these cases, researchers found that the paternal genetic signature did align closely with the documented line of descent from a minor noble house, even in branches of the family that had long since lost any trace of wealth, title, or public memory of that connection. The name had outlived the status. The biology, it turned out, had outlived the paperwork. Not every name behaved this way. Some so-called ancient dynastic surnames tested showed no unusual genetic clustering at all, suggesting the noble origin story attached to them was likely a later invention, adopted for prestige rather than descended from fact. Researchers remain cautious here, and rightly so. Genetic testing can confirm a shared paternal line, but cannot, on its own, confirm which historical figure that line actually belonged to. That step still depends on fragile written records, and written records can be wrong, incomplete, or quietly rewritten by the people who kept them. But for a smaller cluster of names, the 13 surnames at the center of this investigation, the convergence of Y chromosome data, archival land records, and independent genealogical research pointed towards something researchers were reluctant to dismiss as coincidence. Here is the twist worth sitting with. It was not that these families were secretly royal. Most were not. The twist was something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. Several of these dynastic lines had not ended when history said they ended. They had simply stopped being visible. A noble house destroyed in a regional conflict, its land seized, its name stripped from official succession, while a younger son, an illegitimate branch, or a household steward's family quietly continued the paternal line under an unremarkable surname for generations. The dynasty, as history recorded it, was gone. The dynasty, as the Y chromosome recorded it, was not. This is why genetic genealogists are careful to say that DNA does not overturn history. It does something more specific. It reveals which parts of history were never fully written down in the first place. This matters beyond 13 surnames and a handful of forgotten noble houses. For centuries, we have treated family history as something that lives primarily in documents, church registries, land deeds, coats of arms. Documents are fragile. They burn, they get lost, they get deliberately destroyed by the winners of conflicts who prefer a simpler story. A name, spoken and inherited without anyone fully understanding why, can survive all of that. What these surname studies suggest is that ordinary families are sometimes carrying continuity that official history discarded. Not because they were hiding something, because nobody thought to ask. Picture, for a moment, a river valley in Central Europe sometime in the late medieval period. A fortified manor stands on a low hill, its walls already showing the wear of a dynasty in decline. Somewhere below, in the scattered farmhouses along the river, a household of tenant families works the land their grandfathers worked. One of those families shares blood, quiet, undocumented, unacknowledged, with the lord above them. Then the manor falls. War, plague, inheritance dispute, it does not matter which. The name above the gate disappears from the regional records within 2 generations. But down in the valley, the tenant family continues. They keep their own name, plainer, unremarkable, and they keep having sons. The land changes hands a dozen times over the following centuries. Borders shift, kingdoms rise, merge and dissolve. And still, quietly, generation after generation, an unbroken paternal line survives in a name that means nothing more, on paper, than son of the miller. Until, centuries later, a swab of saliva and a spreadsheet of anonymized data bring that vanished manor back into the conversation. Not through a document, but through a Y chromosome that never stopped being copied. That is the part of this story that is easy to miss if you only think in terms of kings and castles. Dynasties, in the way we usually imagine them, are lists of names in a history book, reigns, dates, battles. But a dynasty, biologically speaking, is simply an unbroken line of descent. It does not require a throne. It only requires survival. If you've made it this far, you clearly like the kind of history that hides in plain sight. So let me know in the comments which name, place, or bloodline you'd want investigated next. So what should we actually take from 13 surnames that refused to behave the way the old model predicted? Not that everyone with an old-sounding surname is secretly descended from nobility. Most are not, and the researchers behind this work are careful to say so. Overconfidence is exactly the trap that got surname mythology into trouble in the first place. What we should take instead is something more unsettling and, in its own way, more beautiful. History was never as clean as the record suggests. Names move sideways as often as they move down through generations. Bloodlines survived collapses that were supposed to erase them completely. And the boundary between noble and ordinary turns out to have been far more porous and far more temporary than either side ever fully believed. The old story treated a surname as a label, inherited, static, explainable in a sentence. The genetic and archival evidence suggests something closer to a signal that traveled quietly through centuries of upheaval, sometimes surfacing exactly where no one expected it to. The map of European dynastic history was never wrong, exactly. It was simply incomplete, missing the branches that stopped being written down long before they stopped being alive. Somewhere right now, someone is signing their name on a lease, a form, a birth certificate, without knowing that the string of letters they are writing has survived a war, a famine, a fallen house, and 800 years of silence to reach them. The dynasty did not end. It just stopped being famous.